Welcome, Phil. Welcome to the studio.
Hi, thank you very much, Tony Reeves.
Very
Nice
happy
to be
Friday.
here again.
Is it me, Phil, or is there a touch of sparkle about you today? Am I imagining that? What
Well,
have you
I'll be
been up
honest
to in
with you and
the
say,
workshop?
yes, I am bringing the glitter to the podcast today, quite literally, in fact, because I was nearly late because I've been downstairs with a large fishbowl and a big packet of glitter and a wooden spoon. And your job now is to, ask me why.
So, would you care to elaborate on that? Is there some kind of magic potion you're mixing up down
I
there?
will elaborate. I will elaborate that I during lockdown, which seems like a million years ago now, but during lockdown, I discovered I had a surfeit of creative energy, like myself and many other people, and I sort of started this fortnightly creative challenge via a blog. It was called, we called it the Kickabout, and then essentially the short version is that every 2 weeks, myself and a bunch of other creatives and writers and people all over the world really have to come up with a new piece of work, something creative. They have to make something in a short time, and that often means for me that I sort of have to reach my hand across my desk, grab whatever I can find, make something happen. And in this instance, it involves me downstairs with a large sachet of glitter and a wooden spoon and a body of water. I won't bore people with what's going on there, but that's what I have just been doing. So, but I guess that's relevant to this podcast because I think it's going to help us talk about some more sort of broad principles, right?
Well, yeah, we're talking about sort of learning design sprints because obviously we over the last few months and certainly a couple of years, we've incorporated this idea of sprints both into how we design courses with clients, but also into some of the teaching that we've done. And I know you've mentioned that it's come out of the Kickabout, but it'd be interesting to spend a little bit of time looking at how this idea of the Kickabout, what it is, how that, or what you've learned through doing that in terms of like the power of making and sprints and what it does. So how did the Kickabout come about? Obviously, it came through lockdown, but I mean, what's the methodology? What was the premise? How does it work?
Well, it always makes me smile a bit because obviously you and I there just talking about sprints like it's a word that everybody understands in relationship to anything, and the kickabout, blah blah blah, and essentially, just like a lot of things, and certainly my experience now is that a thing that I was already doing or an itch I was already scratching, you sort of discover, not surprisingly, that it has an existing word or it pertains to a mode of activity or behavior in the world already, obviously. I'm not going to sit here and say, wow, so original. But the one thing about sprints and the kickabout that have in common is this issue of duration. And that, I guess that's the bit I could talk about usefully now, which was simply that back when I was course leader, I was involved in lots of extracurricular projects. And they were exciting projects, they were amazing projects, they were EU funded projects. That will tell you how long ago this was. And but the thing is they were also in the way. They were in the way of my job, and because the inception of these projects meant that the student community, had to be involved in them too. That was where the funding lived. It was also about that we had these amazing opportunities for additional creative acts and additional creative sort of undertakings, but they were always in addition to our sort of like real lives. And so for me, it I had to figure out ways back then about how to get the students and myself to engage in things that didn't take up a huge amount of time, but weren't any less meaningful for that, if you know what I mean. It was like, how can we find a way to get ideas and work and making to happen quickly, to bring people in, to get them involved without then committing them to a massive undertaking that would then pull energy from the stuff that they were supposed to be doing. So anyway, when we got to the lockdown, and obviously people had more time on their hands, but it felt to me that I remembered the way I'd structured some of that work for those EU funded projects. And the thing that I noticed was that if you gave people quite clear boundaries and you also gave them quite a short time, and if you like disconnected the creative practice from the mainstream of their own lives, so you weren't asking painters to paint, or you weren't asking sort of 3D animators to animate, you were asking them to sort of do something new in a short time. I was pretty amazed by how quickly people did those things. And so when it came to the kickabout, I thought, well, if I make this like a monthly creative challenge, it's going to die. If I make this a daily challenge, it's going to start to feel stressful. So the first thing I did was I just said, well, I'll tell you what, let's make it a fortnightly thing. So 2 weeks feels both short and long enough for it to be meaningful. And I decided I would launch it online. I didn't know what would happen. I had about 4 or 5 creative people who'd agreed they would do it. They then reached out and brought a few other people in. And sure enough, the creative prompt went out, and it went out via my blog. It was just like, it was asking people to respond in their own way to a painting. And I was pretty much blown away by what came in. And obviously people were busy, trying to be busy because it was the lockdown. But it's now been running for nearly 4 years. And so there's a group of people who have been making new works in a short time, who are busy. They're practicing artists, they're educators, they've got their own lives, but they're still sort of walking into this creative space to work quickly, to experiment, to take risks, to make work that maybe isn't representative of them or what they would normally do. So it's a site of experimentation, it's a risk-taking space. And the fact it's been running now for nearly 4 years would suggest that it's a welcome space as well. So there was something there, which you and I have talked about, around this sweet spot around risk, duration, and the act of getting something done sort of because you have to. And then what I've also picked up on from a lot of the participants and myself is that something they did quickly has then gone on, perhaps not surprisingly, to be the basis of something they then continued to do, or that they then developed and iterated, or it's changed the way that they work in their mainstream lives. And so this idea of the risk, the sprint, the act of making, the power of doing, to me, it's really begun to inform lots of my conversations now around how we approach course design, how we approach working with clients, how we structure a day, a productive day with a client. It's like, how much time do we really need actually to start the sparks happening? So that's all come out of this kind of idea of a kickabout, really.
It's really interesting because it reminds me of, from my background and years working in higher education, that you would have a module or a course or a unit, whatever you call it, and it would be 10 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, and 16 weeks just always seemed to feel like an incredibly long time. And the perennial problem was that people wouldn't do anything for at least 8 weeks. They might turn up to the sessions and then they'd read some stuff maybe, but they wouldn't actually produce any work because the deadline was so far away that it was almost you couldn't see it, or they couldn't see it. And so there is something interesting here about how the duration drives action and how it sort of starts to overcome this idea of procrastinating, which we're all guilty of to a greater or lesser extent. If something's not urgent, we're probably not going to start it unless we're super keen or super motivated. So it's interesting that deadline is how you use that deadline to drive action and trying to get that deadline right. And like you say, find the sweet spot. So what else have you learned then about how that deadline sort of motivates action? What's come through from the Kickabout and the community in terms of getting people started, and how's that sort of moved into some of the other work that you've done?
Well, I really just want to reflect at you and that notion you talked about, how in some of the more formal sort of educative environments that we know very well, this idea of the 15-week project, the 10-week project, we talk a lot about intentionality and purpose, which is like, why are things the way they are? And the answer, I've got no problem. I'm very agnostic actually about things like duration. I think that it's a bit like movies, right? And I always talk about films, but I love a 3-hour movie. I like a 90-minute movie. I don't like the idea that 90-minute movies are better than 3-hour movies. My belief is if you've got your story right, you won't fill the 3 hours. So for me, intentionality and purpose around duration is always important. So it's not a question of like, if you make things fast, if you go quick and dirty, that's better. The interesting discussion is that what is the effect you're trying to produce in the community of people that you are working with, or what is it that you want? So I would say, and I would caveat everything we're talking about here with that higher sort of idea of intentionality and purpose and design. I would absolutely say that. So I would just put that out there to anyone who's listening, that this isn't sort of an advocacy of, you know, going faster, going harder, sort of all of those things. But I can't help but admit that one of my frustrations when I was sort of in a more formal sort of Monday to Friday educational setting was simply that there was an idea that, for example, a big final major project or something like that absolutely had to take however many weeks, because that was somehow a guarantee that the work would be more profound, it would be more elevated, it would be better. And I can honestly tell you that sometimes that was true, but it was only ever true of the student who started in week 1 of the 30-week project, who was iterating for 30 weeks. It was never true of the work that was made by the student in 2 weeks of that 30. So they did nothing except worry, procrastinate, fall into a cycle of guilt, fall into all of those student behaviors. And I felt that duration was having an effect on that the duration was part of procrastination, that duration and anxiety were linked. Now, I want to admit now that for some people, the idea of being told to get on with something right now can also be anxious making, which is why if you're thinking about designing these quick and dirty sprints, being really clear about why and what you're asking to do is key. All right. It's not the same as being ambushed. It's not the same as being sabotaged. I think that's really, really clear. But I used to see this happening with tutorials and this notion of duration, where people would come in for a tutorial and they would feel that the work was taking place in that talking shop, that there was one tutorial a week, a learner would come in, the tutorial would happen, they'd go away. A week later, nothing had happened except they were waiting for another tutorial because that felt like the work. And I, even then, I made quite clear steps to try and carve up a longer project into these more characterized things. So the first 2 weeks were sort of like ideation, and then we would have like a formative crit. In other words, I was always, in fact, sprinting and trying to bring these long durations under control. So I would say that the kickabout was a manifestation of something perhaps that was already a feeling I was having, or a frustration. I sort of thought that it didn't need to be very long to start producing exciting results, because I'd seen the problem with duration playing out, certainly in higher education, in so many different ways. And I absolutely will say that I think there is a link between duration and mental health with students. And, absolutely, duration could exploit vulnerabilities that were there, for sure. And I would see that happen all the time. It's one of my big frustrations. So the kickabout was in a way a test of an instinct that has since proven to be something that I think has legs to run on, if you excuse the pun. But yeah.
That's super interesting, because it's this. I mean, we were with a client recently, weren't we? And it was about this idea of making and doing as a way to get something out of yourself, get it out of your head, so that you can see it, and that once you see it, that you can get feedback from that thing that you've made. So there was a really interesting dynamic there, where the teaching was being done by the thing that you were making. So you make the thing, you look at the thing is there in front of you, and then the thing that you've made tells you something. It gives you feedback about your own ability, but also about the materials that you've used, and about how long it took you, and what you can potentially do next. And so the artifact, the act of making, is almost a virtuous circle. It produces the next bit of information you need to make the next thing. And like you say, that I suppose in terms of learning design, the interesting thing is then making sure that you're structuring that period of time effectively. So it may still be 16 weeks, but it's not just make one thing in 16 weeks. It's make one thing in a week or a day, and then make the next thing, and then use that. And so by the end of 10 weeks, you might have made 10 things, and then suddenly you're 10 times further along than you were had you only made one thing in 10 weeks. So this idea of making as a tool for making, or making as a tool for teaching, I find really interesting, I think.
And also, I think you can sort of, like, for anyone listening who isn't necessarily coming from that creative space, you know, artifacts, whatever, I just think sort of manifesting something is what we're talking about. And I think about sprints in terms of sort of project management. So if you looked at it on a more corporate or more in a different context, and we've got some experience of that too, in terms of designing for clients and producing sprints in that way, it is about the power of manifesting something so the discussion can start. And I am very conscious of that notion that when your idea is in your head, it is both untried and perfect. And I think the tyranny of perfection, of incipient, unproven perfection, can keep people from making anything for a very long time. But I've got this very non-lowbrow, sort of non-highbrow sort of expression of this, because I did some training recently for some faculty out in at a university in India, where I'm doing some work, and that originally that piece of work was around the idea of student procrastination. I'm not suggesting that problem was specific to that campus. I'm just suggesting that it was something that those tutors were interested in, about how they could sort of get a bit of energy at the beginning of a unit, you know, at the beginning of a project, get the energy up and then maintain it, as opposed to this idea of you launch a brief and then no one really does anything about it. And I have always liked the idea of the Goldilocks sort of approach, you know, and I'm sure this is something that is not my idea, but it is simply that notion that in the Goldilocks story, the only way that Goldilocks, who we know is the villain of the piece because she's a housebreaker and she steals people's food, but anyway, if we sort of put that to one side,
that's fine.
We put that to one side. I'm not endorsing that, by the way. That Goldilocks takes a view on porridge, and she can only understand that the porridge that she enjoys is just right in terms of its temperature, is because there are 3 bowls of porridge, right? So it's not rocket science. The story tells us that the first bowl is too hot. The second bowl she tries is too cold, and the middle porridge is just right. I think in some stories it's the amount of sugar, but it doesn't matter. The point is that with 3 bowls, the feedback loop, the knowledge, is more reliable, because if she just made 1 bowl of porridge and ate it, she would have some feedback on it. She would be able to iterate to a degree, but it's a stronger and more persuasive feedback cycle because there were 3 bowls of porridge, right? So I don't want to over-egg this quite simple idea, but I think it's very important. You know, it's important to sort of produce more than one, and that notion of sometimes when I was working sort of back with students, where they would make one thing and then literally another week would pass and then a second thing would arrive, and it was like, no, if you could just do all of that a little bit quicker, then we can start to get to more high level feedback and we can start to get to more interesting iterations. So really, I guess what we're talking about when it comes to this sort of thing isn't actually about just the act of producing something quickly. It's producing the conditions for iteration. And iteration is, I suppose you might say, knowledge that belongs to the learner, because as you just said, the manifested thing produces the feedback. It's not the tutor saying, it's not the other person saying, oh, it would be really good if you tried X. They've got that voice, surely, but the more perhaps interesting voice, the more transformative voice is coming from the thing they've made, the idea that they've manifested, because then the tuition is between themselves and the thing. Obviously, the tuition is in that role, and I think for nervous learners or learners who have had terrible experiences of teaching systems, I can totally see how manifesting an object in this way or getting an idea out can defang anxiety around getting things wrong or right, because the relationship is between the person and their own work. The challenge is producing that first iteration. And I know that with some with anxiety and with sort of procrastination, breaking that is hard. I absolutely think that is where duration becomes the learning designer's province. Really, it's really important to think about duration purposefully, because it is powerful. And if you don't think about it, I think it can run away with the design of what you're doing a bit. It can sort of start to have powers that you weren't really expecting it to. So
yeah, there's a danger, isn't there, with duration, that if you don't think about it intentionally, or even if you do and that your hands are tied around it, as you know, it's like it has to be this long, that you still have to work with it purposefully. So if you can't change the duration, the question then has to move to, well, what can I do effectively within this, whether it's an hour, 3 hours, 3 weeks, 10 weeks, 16 weeks, whatever. It's if that is the box you're designing into, and I suppose this is where learning design is squarely in the design discipline. It's like that's your box, that's your space, that's your room, that's what you've got to work with, and those are your constraints. What's the best use of that time, and how do you create the conditions for meaningful iteration? And I think it's also, as you said, it's important to not just limit this to thinking about making creative, in inverted commas, artifacts. It's easy to think that this is about making pictures or paintings or pots or physical objects, but actually, if you think about what AI now enables us to do in terms of writing, you can now iterate writing much more quickly, or certainly students can, and pretty much everyone can, much more quickly than was previously possible. So the value is in what you learn through those iterations. So there's a really interesting implication for how we think about designing assessment of written work or written projects, because what you're assessing has to shift. And this is, I know, a lot of the debates around AI at the moment, but thinking about assessment through the lens of iteration, so it might make it easy to say, okay, well, actually, what we need to do is make sure that we can see evidence of iteration, and more importantly, we can see evidence of what's being learned through each iteration, and why the learner made the choice that they did on the basis of that iteration, whether it's an essay or a project or a pot, whatever it is. Like, why did they do that and not something else? And what was the justification for that? And that then gives us a way into assessing iteration more so than getting lost on assessing the final artifacts, I guess.
Well, I just want to say very quickly, anecdotally, so just in the last couple of years before I sort of left an institution, I ran into this ridiculous paradox around sort of plagiarism technology, which was that in the final part of year 2, the students were asked to produce a proposal for their dissertation, okay? And the proposal for the dissertation would go through, I think it was Turnitin, I don't know if it's still Turnitin. And because the students were asked to write in long form, so they're basically asked to write a long form dissertation proposal, which when they put it through Turnitin, then meant that they could never use anything that they'd written again, because it was in the system. So you were asking them to sort of iterate, and then you were disenfranchising them from their thoughts and from their own use of words, because they couldn't then reuse that. Not all of them wanted to reuse it because they were iterating. But so one of the big decisions I took was to make sure that that final dissertation proposal in its format was not long form. It looked nothing like an essay. It looked nothing like a dissertation proposal. What it was, however, was genuinely useful, because it could go in through this bit of technology. And then when it came to the actual dissertation, they could write from it, they could use it, they could bank the time. In other words, I think my point really is that I was beginning to sprint the dissertation development and to me that was so important, because writing and literacy, as you know, for a lot of people, the question marks about the value of it, around the way that it can sort of inflame the pain centers of non-traditional students, and where language isn't their first language, all those real and proper reasons as to why the assertion that a dissertation is the best possible capture of someone's brain, we all know that's a problematic concept. But I was beginning to move towards a sprint model even then, even though I didn't have the language for it, because it was like, if we can turn iteration into what we're really talking about, if iteration becomes key, then why shouldn't we have an entire year group with first-class dissertations at the end of the year? Not because some marking scheme has lost its mind, but because of the quality and the because of iteration. That iteration is where the power lives. And of course, getting a draft out, getting that first draft out, getting it done in a timely way, produce the conditions for transformative feedback. And again, I think that if you look at the kickabout or the sprints, you're really talking about feedback. You're talking about the conditions for meaningful and transformative feedback. And again, that really, I think, dovetails with duration, because in the end, if you're a learner, you are largely waiting for feedback. In a way, you're doing some work. And so I used to sometimes see that the spaces, the great gaps between the brief and the feedback, it just stopped making any sense to me. It started to look like the performance of academia in a way, but also a slight folklore that we have about how much time we need to stare out into space. Now, I'm not suggesting that we don't need that time, but I'm suggesting that procrastination is the answer to that, because procrastination is a corrosive trait we all have. And I think when it comes to people feeling better about what it feels like to learn, you've got to walk into that space and try and project manage some of those behaviors. And I honestly believe that I mean, sprints tend to be a project management term. It's something that project managers enact. But the idea of project managing student behaviors or learners' behaviors and designing into that space and using and being a little bit contrary around existing ideas around duration and the time it takes for people to do stuff. I think there is a debate there, which of course you and I are having all the time, and increasingly meeting clients and different learning scenarios where it's absolutely the right thing to do. It's absolutely contrary to that 3-year durational, long drawn out sort of semester experience. I'm just seeing a lot of effective learning that's literally nothing like that. You know, yeah. It's got nothing in common with some of those existing structures.
It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, it's a good place to round up, I think, is this idea of this being purposeful around duration and also just designing into the space that you've got. So if you cannot change that, the duration that you've got to work within, how can you build almost like mini durations within it, mini sprints, mini week-long activities, whatever it happens to be, so that you do make that time purposeful and you don't inadvertently produce procrastination because you've just been given a 16-week block of time to fill, and you just think, well, that's great, we'll do something at the end of it. So just to round off, where can people find out about the Kickabout, because it's still running? And
it's still running. Yeah, well, you just if you literally, if you go to I have a website, philgom.com, and if you go to the website, you'll see there's a tab dedicated to the Kickabout, and it's like it's an anthology of all previous editions. So we're just about to, we're not far off our 100th Kickabout.
Wow, really?
And it's it's amazing. And just a big shout out to the people who are kicking about with me, because it's also, we haven't talked about it and we haven't got time, but there's an element here, more than a small element, around the power of community and the incentive that comes from sharing. The incentive of sharing and the incentive of, you might say, a community of practice. Sitting alongside all of these discussions, there is another parallel discussion about motivation and why we produce, and the power of an emoji to make it all seem worthwhile. There's a lot of stuff there that we haven't gotten into about why people continue with something, I think, in that respect. And I think community and the incentive of sharing is key, really.
Okay, well, we'll make that the subject of a forthcoming podcast then. I think the community aspect, because as we know, there's a lot to unpack around there. I'll share the link to your, I know you've written recently about a summary of jumpers for goalposts and the Kickabout. I'll share a link to that underneath in the podcast notes and underneath the LinkedIn post. So if anyone would like to find out more about the Kickabout and jumpers for goalposts and the idea of sprints, and if you'd like to get involved, then have a look at the blog and see what people are sharing, because there is a ton of creative inspiration there, I have absolutely no doubt. So Phil, happy Friday. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week for the next one.
Thank you very much, Tony. A happy weekend, and speak to you very soon.
Very soon.